Today, I'd like to conduct a side-by-side comparison of the trump sequences in major historical tarot decks. Tarot originated as a game in northern Italy about 600 years ago, and tarot games are still played today, predominantly in France and Austria. Early tarot cards were imbued with manifold encyclopedic, cultural and religious references, but actual divination with tarot cards only began around 200 years ago, when French occultists rediscovered the so-called Tarot de Marseille. Due to this fact, the vast majority of currently available tarot decks, and there are literally thousands, is ultimately based on that one single deck, the Tarot de Marseille. But even a cursory glance at historical decks will reveal how differently the trumps, called major arcana in divinatory circles, are ordered in them. On screen, we see Bolognese tarot, where, for example, the three virtues temperance, justice and fortitude are consecutive, whereas they're interspersed by other trumps in the Tarot de Marseille. So barring countless small differences in the past as well as the present, it appears that 6 decks can well exemplify the most salient building blocks. First, there are 3 typically Italian decks from Bologna in the north, Florence somewhat towards the centre, and Sicily in the south. Tarot originated in the north and gradually moved south. These 3 decks share the characteristic that the 3 virtues present in all tarot decks appear as an undivided block, but the tarot also moved west and north rather early on. The oldest trump sequence attested in contemporary literature is in fact sequence A from Ferrara. A, B and C all have in common that the aforementioned virtues are separated by other cards. C is the very Marseille order from southern France, popularized by most commercially available tarot decks. And there's a sequence attested from Pavia in northwest Italy, but also used in an interesting French deck by Jacques Viéville from the year 1650 that seems to form the link between A and C. The Bologna, Sicilian and Marseille decks are rather easily obtainable online, whereas the so-called Florentine minchiate, which is by the way a dirty word in Italian, as well as reproductions of the Tarot de Viéville, are somewhat more difficult to come by. I do not know of any commercially available tarot deck that will use the Ferrara trump order, notwithstanding its earliest attestation, but we can perhaps surmise that the trumps in the so-called Visconti tarot decks, plural, from Milan, might have been ordered accordingly. Trump cards in the original decks were not numbered, and modern copies all display the anachronistic Marseille order, unfortunately. Before we get to the decks themselves, I'd also like to recommend select literature for those interested in a history of tarot cards and tarot games. Michael Dummett, a British philosopher, wrote prolifically on the tarot, the game of tarot being perhaps his magnum opus. Stuart Kaplan's richly illustrated Encyclopedia of Tarot is a good starting point to familiarise oneself with a plethora of different tarot decks. For readers of French, Thierry de Police is a household name in the arena of tarot research. Tarots Enluminés follows the art of early tarot cards, and Le Tarot Révélé speaks to the history of the tarot from its very inception. For readers of German, the famous playing card museum not far from Stuttgart in southwest Germany has published an introduction to tarot decks. And Hans-Joachim Alscher has put together essays on tarot history and research under the name Tarot, mein einziges Vergnügen. Now let's get to the 6 decks and start in Bologna. The Bolognese tarot cards are somewhat elongated, and trumps as well as court cards are double-headed, mirrored, and hence optimized for card play. Indices, however, are only found on 12 trump cards, and are not positioned in all corners or even 1 or 2 consistent corners. The 5 lowest trumps as well as the 4 highest trumps, the so-called Begato, Mori and Arie, have no indices. But if the highest one, the Angel of Judgment Day, were numbered, it would bear the number 20, not 21, although there are 21 trumps. This is due to the fact that the lowest trump, the Begato, is not just unindexed, it's also implicitly unnumbered. Henceforth, by the way, I'll be laying out the cards in consecutive columns from left to right as follows. This will help us emphasize some of the remarkable symmetries within the decks. Now, whether or not these symmetries were indeed the very motivation of arranging the trumps, we might never find out, since the treatises only ever state the order ipso facto without going into its evolution. But even if this symmetrical arrangement might never be proved, it can at least serve mnemotechnic purposes. Distilled into its essence, the deck features a number of social ranks on the left, starting with a matto, i.e. the fool, who's not a trump in the earliest tarot games, rather originally a card that excused a player from following suit, but the fool is still a social figure, as is the lowest trump, the begato, bagatto, or butler, i.e. the player or the fair magician, followed by an array of other usually courtly figures but replaced with 4 Moors here in Bologna. This block is followed by a larger symmetrical block of 10 allegories on the right. The 10 allegories are commonly called Love, the Lover or the Lovers, I'll stick with the singular, and the Chariot, then the Wheel of Fortune and Old Age, later called the Hunchback or the Hermit, the Hangman and Death, which always bears the number 13 and around which the entire symmetry revolves. Then the Devil and the Tower, also called the lightning bolt, or by analogy the arrow, the house of the devil, or conversely the house of God. It usually depicts a crumbling tower hit by lightning. And finally the world, or rather an idealized picture of a paradisical world, with Mercury hovering over it in the Bolognese deck at least, and the angel blowing the trumpets of Judgment Day. To get into all the details of the iconography of these cards would break the mold of the current objective. Suffice to say that some of these allegories seem to exhibit planetary features. The Venusian lover met by Venus, the martial chariot of Mars, Jupiter's wheel-like mandorla, whereas old age, as well as death, have distinct features of Saturn. Kronos in Greek, transcribed with a K, quickly conflated with Kronos with a CH, the god of time. These 10 allegories are interspersed with 3 of the 4 cardinal virtues, temperance, justice and fortitude. The 4th one, prudence, is almost always missing, as well as 3 celestial luminaries, a star, the moon and the sun. The 3 virtues are the most mobile cards across the different tarot decks. Their symmetrical alignment with the stationary block of the 3 lights might well have played a role in the evolution of the different trump arrangements. When compared to all the other trump sequences, the Bolognese arrangement seems to exhibit the most stable and quintessential pairings of allegories. It's merely justice that ranks before fortitude when compared to other Italian decks. This might well be the original sequence, since justice moved upwards in the deck very early on, as we shall see. And the 4 court cards were soon replaced by 4 North African Moors, indistinguishable in rank here in Bologna. Death is numbered 13 across all extant tarot decks, barring a few dubious outlier examples, thus being the one and only card with consistent numbering, and the initiators of the different decks seem to have gone to considerable length to keep death at 13, usually by shortening the deck or by placing one of the virtues above death. But in Bologna, the altered court of 4 Moors did not need to be abridged, and all 3 virtues also rank below death, because the lowest trump has no number. The Bolognese arrangement seems to have been seminal, and there is reason to believe that it ranks amongst the most original ones due to its purity, although the earliest attested order is the one used in, for example, Ferrara, that we'll get to later on. With the tarot moving a tad further south and reaching Florence, we find a few original sequences of 21 trumps in literature, but relatively soon the number of trumps explodes and reaches 40. The game of minchiate, a dirty word in Italian, hence often also called germini, played with this expanded deck soon overshadowed other tarot card games in popularity and reached, for example, Dresden in Germany, as well as Sicily, France and other places. 20 of the original 21 trumps remain here, since the court is only 3 cards long, seemingly missing the Pope, but the lover has moved to the left, now forming part of the court that was collectively called Papi, i.e. the Popes. Along with the lover, the wheel also moves to the left when compared to the Bolognese order, intruding the space just before the chariot and tugging along the 3 virtues. The 5 highest cards, the so-called arie, also coloured distinctively red in the game of minchiate, i.e. the 3 luminaries and the 2 highest allegories, were usually unnumbered. Their order was known to players, and they were also worth more card points than other cards. An entire block of 20 additional trumps was then inserted just before the arie. These were 4 additional virtues, the hitherto missing prudence, and the 3 Christian virtues, hope, faith and charity, as well as the 4 elements and the 12 signs of the zodiac, in a very peculiar order that I'll cover in another video. Iconographically, it's difficult to overlook remarkable parallels between the ship depicted on the water card and a card in the Sicilian tarot that we'll get to, as well as the 2 buildings and the 2 dogs on the earth card, very reminiscent of the scene depicted on the moon card in the Tarot de Marseille. But these shall remain just a few cursory remarks for the time being. We've reached the 3rd Italian deck, where all 3 virtues still form an indivisible block, the Tarocco Siciliano from Sicily. The highest trump is numbered 20, and the court is still abridged to keep death at 13, but there's an unnumbered 21st trump named Miseria, ranking just below trump number 1. Although the court is just 2 cards long, merely showing an empress and an emperor, an additional virtue, constancy, only ever found in Sicily, has assumed the position of the Pope, whereas the entire block of the lover, the wheel of fortune and old age moves to the right when compared to the order of trumps found in the aforementioned Florentine game of minchiate/germini. Sicilian cards are amongst the smallest tarot cards in size, and the suit cards not depicted here follow the Portuguese pattern, whilst the trump cards are of exquisite clarity due to the wide background and lack of clutter. Iconographically, the deck exhibits quite a few peculiarities. Most notably, the devil, the world and the angel have turned into a ship, Atlas and Jupiter. Trump number 1 shows a group of players, the Pisciotti. The tower is not crumbling, the hangman is hung from his neck, not his foot, and the three lights show scenes presumably connected to classical mythology. This brings us to the second group of tarots, where the three virtues are scattered across the deck. We'll start with the order from Ferrara, and presumably also other cities such as Venice and Milan, which is the earliest arrangement actually attested in literature, say, by Bertoni. As mentioned earlier on, modern reproductions keep with the Tarot de Marseille numbering, which we should disregard due to its much later attestation. Early trump cards were not numbered, and we also do not possess trump sequences from the times of the very inception of the tarot. We must not necessarily assume that the Ferrara arrangement is the most original one, albeit definitely the first attested one. It might prove easier to derive the sequence from one more closely related to the Proto-Bolognese one. The court is fully staffed with 4 cards, the fourth being the Popus, whose position is either just before the Pope or sometimes before the Emperor. The virtues start spreading out, justice acquiring the fitting and biblically apocalyptical position between the angel of Judgment Day and the world, that both switch places, but so do the lowest 2 allegories, the Chariot and the Lover, though not consistently, whilst Temperance assumes a position just before this latter pair. When arranged in columns, the symmetrical order becomes quite apparent. And we can also clearly observe the tendency to position one of the virtues above death, so as to retain its apparently crucial number 13. I've already created content expounding on this number's significance for the tarot. Most notably, tarot decks are usually comprised of 78 equals 6 times 13 cards, and there are also exactly 6 times 13 points to gain in the original card game. This brings us to a sequence that is often treated as merely a variant of the Tarot de Marseille one, but its early attestation in Pavia, along with its transitional nature just between the Ferrara and Marseille arrangements, renders it worthy of being considered separately. There are but a few commercially available decks exhibiting that order, when it's usually a reproduction of the deck made by the Parisian card maker Jacques Viéville. The Popus assumes its later on canonical position just before the Empress. The Lover usually reverts back to preceding the Chariot, whilst the 2 top trumps remain arranged just like in Ferrara. The world does still trump in the Angel/Judgment, and the 2 virtues, Temperance and Justice, huddle closer together while switching their relative positions to Fortitude. Iconographically speaking, the Viéville deck is very close to the Belgian tarot tradition, where, for example, trump number 16 is La Foudre, i.e. a lightning bolt, but hidden a tree rather than a tower. In Viéville's version, it's even simply a tree without a clear depiction of lightning. Most cards are mirrored left to right when compared to the more popular Tarot de Marseille, whilst the hangman even appears standing upright. Last but not least, we get to the youngest and currently most iconic sequence of tarot trumps, the one from Marseille, that gave rise to the overwhelming majority of all presently available tarot decks. This is but one modern rendition of one of the Marseille tarots that are available in many different forms and formats, not even counting the numerous divination decks whose iconography is always derivative of that same Tarot de Marseille, albeit infused with the ponderings of predominantly French and British occultists. The symbolic significance of tarot cards as used in modern divination was derived from the assumption that the full plus the 21 trumps correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, that in turn had already been assigned elements, planets, and the zodiac by Hebrew mystics. How exactly this came about and why it triggered, for example, the swap of Justice and Fortitude in many modern decks would constitute the topic of another video. In comparison to the Pavia/Viéville order, 2 swaps have taken place. Justice and Fortitude both move to the right. As a result, each of the 5 pairs of allegories is directly followed by either one of the 3 virtues or the indivisible block of 3 luminaries, thus achieving equidistant distribution. However, Justice and Fortitude seem to have not just simply moved, they actually switched their positions with the trump whose spot they assumed. Therefore, Old Age/the Hermit appears to have moved before the Wheel of Fortune, which normally didn't happen in any of the aforementioned decks. First, Wheel of Fortune, then Old Age is the usual sequence. In summary, the history of the tarot is incredibly rich, and there are considerably more surprising details than first meet the eye. Let's remain curious. And that will be that. Thank you so much.